Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Vicker, Communications Professor Emeritus from St. John Fisher University, and it's my pleasure to be interviewing Dr. Holly Bender, Professor and Director of the Office of Educational Research and Development at the University of Arizona College of Veterinary Medicine. Holly is one of the plenary speakers for the 22nd Annual TBL meeting in Orlando, Florida, and her talk on March 12th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time is entitled From Novice to Expert, Rethinking the Role of TBL Pre-Work. So Holly, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Lauren. It's a big pleasure being here.
Well, we're really excited to have you as one of our plenary speakers. And, I have met so many people from the medical education field in the Team-Based Learning Collaborative. It seems like most of them are from medical schools and schools of pharmacy, not so much from veterinary medicine. So could you tell us a little bit about your career path and how you actually ended up in this position?
Thank you. Well, it's been kind of a long and winding road. It's one of those that, I have an intention to go one way and then life happens and it sends me in another way. And at the time it seems very confusing, but it always ends up to be the best. And so I feel like super fortunate. I was a long time ago, I went to veterinary school intending to be a dairy practitioner, and I was for a short while, never thinking I'd be a professor. I mean, last thing on my list. But at the time, Virginia Tech was opening its new veterinary school, and they recruited me from practice. I had only graduated a year previously, and they had a skeleton faculty of just specialists in different areas. And my department chair was my former anatomy teacher. And when I was going to Michigan State, and he says, "Hey, you just graduated, you know everything. You need to fill in all the gaps." So I ended up basically teaching anything that nobody else wanted to teach.
Wow, that's incredible.
And then assisting in a lot of things. So it was almost like going back to veterinary school. I was, things that nobody wants to teach, like biochemistry, really hard things like acid-base balance. That was my first thing that I ever took on, was acid-base balance. Nobody likes to teach that. I taught anatomy, histology, pathology, clinical pathology, physical exam. I mean, you name it. It just a very, very long list of things. And I was in the library, when people went to libraries back then, I was in there a lot and just really started digging deep into, all of the mechanisms underneath disease, not just, going through veterinary school at the time, it was very memorization focused. They would throw just lots and lots of information at you. And, they thought that maybe magic would happen at some point and it all kind of come together. And so it was my chance to really dig into it and understand deeply, because for some reason there wasn't such a thing called active learning back then. Right. It was just, I just knew that when I started talking about things that related to my students' lives, to understanding, what they would be doing in their future lives as veterinarians, and did a lot with cases right out of the bat. And they could, I would always put them, you're a veterinarian and you've just been called out on an emergency call, and then I'd give them lots of, lab data to interpret or something. And they get so excited. I mean, it was like, oh my gosh, I'm getting to, think like a veterinarian. And or even when it was, what typically were, subjects like biochemistry that students don't tend to like to do, when I'd be given, glycolysis, and instead of just having them memorize all of the chemical formulas and everything, I would say, hey, who's an athlete in the class? And I get a whole bunch of, yes, I'm an athlete, all right, you come down here, do 20 push-ups, and then we talk about what's going on in their muscles, and and they would all of a sudden they would like biochemistry, and so that kind of started this whole thing, is that people would light up, they'd get excited, cases would make them excited, and clinical pathology was a course, and my mentor was a clinical pathologist that I ended up specializing in that. And he was just an amazing teacher, and he used all cases. Everything was cases. And so we together developed like 130 cases that went from really simple, and then it built to very complex at the end. And so we did this for years together, and then he retired, and I took over that class, and I did my residency and PhD while I was working full time, because I'm a glutton for punishment.
Wow.
Anyway, I took over that course, and I realized that, it was the very first time. It ended up being like the second semester of their second year of school, and to be able to interpret laboratory data and make some sort of sense out of it was very difficult for them to do, because they had like all of their first year and a half, and then really all through K through 12 and undergrad was memorization. And nobody had ever had anything where they have to put the pieces together. And so when they would get into my class, they would get really excited because all of these cases, and they could see themselves doing this, and they'd see in their mentors do this, But when when their mentors would hold up laboratory data, they go, renal failure, right? And so they wanted to be able to go, renal failure. And it doesn't work that way as a novice, right? You have that type 1 and type 2 thinking, you have to, as a novice, you really have to, take it step by step and really break things down.
Yeah.
And then once you get all that knowledge built up, then you can race through the diagnosis, and everything is very clear. But, so I'd given this case of, a short history, putting themselves in this, responsible position of making this diagnosis, and then a couple pages of lab data. They get to the end of the history, and they somehow pull a diagnosis out of the air, having not looked at the lab data, which is what clinical pathology is all about, is interpreting lab data. And anyway, and then, of course, then they'd look through the data after they'd gotten the diagnosis, and then they would just pick out, the things that supported it, and kind of, well, let's not look at this other thing. and you do that on the first 1, 2, 3 cases, and you keep getting it wrong. You do that on the first 50 cases, then they're like, I'm gonna be a terrible failure in life, and so and so I established this methodology of, you need to pretend like you're Sherlock Holmes. You need to, Sherlock doesn't accuse the first person that walks in the room. No, it was the maid. That's the local constable. That he always makes. He always shows up, and so you got to walk the grounds and stir the ashes in the fireplace, and dust on the mantle and all that sort of stuff, and put all the pieces together. So I had them I had this whole methodology of how they'd have to put make a hypothesis on what some lab data is, and then make an outline of, their hypothesis of that part of what was going on, and then put underneath it the abnormalities that would support that, and then build like a whole causal hierarchy of what, their story was, of how, what that disease condition was. And then only then at the end would they make the diagnosis. And so they'd have to account for everything. But at that time, everything was on paper.
Right. And was everybody working in teams at that point, or was that
they could work together if they wanted to, but this was homework, and then we would come and have students present different things, and it would be like more of an interactive session. But this was a long time ago. And so anyway, that, what happened was, there would be some people that would get it right away and they could go flying, and that would be fine. But there was a good proportion of the class, in fact, it was the majority of the class, that kept doing that, jumping to conclusions. And so they would start to get very frustrated. And I started not getting a lot of eye contact in the halls after, 50 cases go by and you're not doing well, right? Because these are all really smart, very motivated people. And so I developed software that with the team, and a whole bunch of grants that would gate the process, and it wouldn't let them jump to conclusions. It wouldn't do the thinking for them, but you ended up, identifying all these lab abnormalities, dragging and dropping all of the abnormalities in a causal hierarchy, and then making your diagnosis, and then they would get to see mine once they. So this was, a flipped class before I even knew what a flipped class was, because they would do that for homework. And then we would come in and I'd give them, we would do exercises around a similar case, that in class. And so it's just, I did a lot of this by the seat of my pants and just stuff that worked, right? And we got millions of dollars in grants to write this software, and wow. Then it, I partnered with other vet schools. It eventually went out to 25 different vet schools, and in the North America and also some in Europe and a little bit in South America. And so, and then we saw massive learning gains. We did studies on it and saw massive learning gains. And so this sort of, so I spent 22 years at Virginia Tech, and then was recruited to Iowa State. I had a giant grant and a research team, and we all went to Iowa State. We did the same thing there. And then this grant, my grant officer was it was a U.S. Department of Education FIPSI grant. And my program officer really loved this program, and she really wanted it to be used in human medicine because she'd been misdiagnosed a few times. And wow. Anyway, so Boyd Richards, who was then at Baylor, was also one of her grant. And so she would pair us up and have us speak at different venues called the high tech and low tech answer to educational problems. And he was the guy that spread TBL throughout human medicine. And so he was the one that introduced me to TBL.
Ah, okay.
And so he took me to a medical conference at the University of Iowa. And I remember him, this huge auditorium full of physicians, and he passed out this piece of paper that had, it was several paragraphs, and they were supposed to get into teams and pick out the best use of the sentence with the best use of passive voice. And all of a sudden I saw them deeply engaged with each other. I'm like, this is so confusing. I mean, physicians looking at the best use of passive voice. Like, I bet they haven't thought about the best use of passive voice since undergrad, classes, and they probably didn't care about it then. So anyway, I was like, I got to try this. And one thing led to another, and it turns out that Larry Michelson's daughter lived outside of Ames, Iowa, and there was a very happenstance that happened. And so we invited him in, my research group and I invited him in to give a workshop at our school. And then I started using it exclusively in my classes. And, it was just, we had a really good thing with this Prework that was, helped them practice on these cases. And then, once they came to class, they were ready. They were ready to engage, right? And before, it was like a lot of, unevenness, and, some people did it, some people didn't, we never really knew. But that formed the pre-work for my TBL. And that the TBL just really got the students engaged, just like the physicians with the with in that auditorium. They just, I couldn't ever go back after that. So that's how I got into TBL. And then later, when I got, because I had success in the classroom, I got recruited to be in charge of faculty development all cross campus, and also future faculty like PhD candidates and postdocs. And so I was at the associate director of the teaching center, in charge of all that. And so we started doing, we invited Larry for a couple more, and then he went, Holly, you can do this now. So I started putting on these workshops, and we eventually had like a 250 member faculty learning community, TBL faculty learning community.
Wow.
And then we meet. It was phenomenal. And they were from all over campus. We had every different discipline you could think of. And I partnered with these wonderful faculty members that would periodically, they would lead this learning community with me. And it was phenomenal. We would just get together and help each other. First we would have an introductory on how to do TBL, but then we would get together and help. We'd call it application exercise first aid. We'd help each other optimize our application exercises and learn about how to write good multiple choice questions and all that sort of stuff. And so we just had this wonderful community. But meanwhile, I had been showing off my software. At that time, it was called the Diagnostic Pathfinder, to my veterinary pathology colleagues at our international conferences. And the director of the veterinary diagnostic lab, who's also a clinical pathologist, was very intrigued with what this community around the software was, and also very intrigued with TBL. And so starting in about 2006, we would meet every year at our conference and have lunch and talk about what would be like the best, the most optimum curriculum for a veterinary college. And she was just fascinated with all this, and she started doing some things with her own. She taught some undergrads, and she used the software in TBL for her undergrads, and she got really excited about it. And so we would meet. And then, at the time, Arizona had been trying to start a vet school for 50 years and failing.
Wow.
And she is a force to contend with. And she kept saying, we're going to start a veterinary college. And I was like, well, at the time they thought that we were over flooding the market with veterinarians. Now there's like a massive shortage, but she believed it. Name's Sharon Dials. She's amazing. And she eventually sent me this curriculum, and I was like, wow, that's beautiful. And she says, well, you should like it. It's what we've been talking about for the last X number of years, never thinking that I would be here, right? And then she and the associate dean recruited me here. And, I'd been doing faculty development all that time. I did that for 10 years at Iowa State. And so after I got here, I did a year and a half as associate dean, interim associate dean. But now I'm doing what I came here to do, and that's faculty development, and it's just thrilling. We have just wonderfully talented faculty, and the whole curriculum is team-based learning, some peer instruction. I've gotten a lot of coaching from Dean Parmalee as well, and so I've gotten I feel very, very fortunate to have both Larry and Dean and others that have really helped this effort, and
Yeah.
here I am, and we've now accepted our third class of students, and it's so much fun to go in the classroom.
That's just an incredible story. Were there any faculty you found who were resistant to using TBL? And they're like, well,
Oh, sure.
that's not how I teach, it's too different from the way that I've learned. And many of them learned from their own professors, right? So
You
how
bet.
did you overcome that, or how were you able to persuade them, besides the dean saying, everybody's going to do this?
Well, it is part of it, it is our vision, right? We are part of our vision is we want to do evidence-based active learning, lecture free, flipped, TBL. The TBL is probably it's throughout our whole curriculum.
Mm.
And so when people come on, they know that this is the type of teaching we do here. I think sometimes it's easier. I mean, it's hard to start a veterinary school, especially we started right as the pandemic came,
Right. That's right.
In fact, I got hired. I was about ready to move out there, and that weekend they were like, you might as well just stay.
No.
Everything shut down,
Oh,
So our whole
dear.
first year was but I had actually had some practice doing TBL online because we had a 2+2 program. They spend their part of the class would spend their first 2 years at University of Nebraska, and then they would join us at Iowa State for the second 2 years. But they didn't have a clinical pathologist, so this was way before Zoom, but I had to do it online. So I had teams there, and I had teams locally, and we would
Wow.
we would have cameras that were on both, and so I would call on teams here and I'd call on teams there, and if a team here couldn't answer it, I'd say, you could phone a friend, and they'd usually pick on the other side. And so there was this lovely little fun thing that went back and forth between the Ames and the Lincoln groups. And then when they got together in their third year, they kind of knew each other. And so it really, really worked. And Larry helped me through that. He put me in touch with a pharmacologist that had done that at University of Oklahoma. And he really coached me through what that would entail. And he gave me great advice. So
that is just an incredible story. So let's talk about your plenary for the TBLC conference. So as I mentioned, from novice to expert, rethinking the role of TBL pre-work. So this not only reflects the practice of your school, but also the research that you've been doing. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
So I'm a veterinarian. I'm not a PhD in education, but I'm very interested in educational research. And so this was back in the late 90s. I was able to put together a multidisciplinary research group. And at that time, that kind of wasn't done. But now it's all the rage, right? Everybody thinks we've always done this, but at that time, I was highly discouraged. But I had this great vision of what I wanted the software to do. And there was a lot of software that was being developed at that time, but I went to the experts and they told me, the computer scientists and everybody on campus, and they said, you can't do this. This cannot be done. And so, but I really wanted to do it. And so I put together a research group, and we had some seed grants on campus. And so I had a veterinary informaticist. I had been working with the College of Education at Virginia Tech, and they sent me their best and brightest graduate student who needed a project, and he thought it was a really cool project. And I had written a grant, and I had money to hire a programmer, and one just happened to get lost on the way through. I mean, a lot of stuff like this happens. It's wild. I mean, I was joking with these graduate students because we went through a lot of programmers and nobody could handle it. And there was this person that was like peeking through my lab window, and she says, I'm looking for this professor down the hall, and he tells me that I need to go to vet school if I want to help animals. And I was joking because I had just like 20 minutes ago gotten this grant. I'm like, I have no idea who I'm going to hire. And I said, well, it depends. Do you know Java? And I just pulled it out of I was like giddy at the time. And I said, do you know Java? And she said, oh, I teach Java. And so for the next 10 years, we worked together and built this beautiful program. And between Pam and Jared, they worked out, the interface and all of the technology that it needed. And it was this massive success that just went worldwide. It's been a phenomenal journey.
Wow.
And then, not only did I have massive learning gains, which we published, and that my partners did too, had similar learning gains. And so, we were able to do lots of work on this. But during that time, so I got to work with this education PhD who was digging in the literature, and he introduced me to this process called deliberate practice. And looking back at this, I just thought it was just radical common sense, right? That you just, you don't start out a novice veterinary student on really dense literature, or you don't just throw a lot of information at them and then having them, a novice, trying to put that together. It's painful. A lot of people, you start off with something that they can handle, and then you give them at that level, and then you give them feedback, and then you give them a little more challenge. And that's the way we built our cases. And our feedback at the time was in class, but the software did that for them, because when they would come up with their diagnostic rationale and their diagnosis, then they would submit it, and then they could see mine and right away at their homework. And so he found this researcher who was doing this groundbreaking research in expertise, Kay Anders Ericcson. And he had studied all sorts of different professions, expertise. Like he did athletes like basketball players, tennis players. He studied chess players. He studied tennis players, surgeons, medicine clinicians. And he looked at what separated those real top performers, those peak performers, from those that they like to call experienced non-experts. Just very polite way of saying you never quite made it, right? Yeah. And so, and the thing that he came up with, which Malcolm Gladwell made famous to the lay public, was this 10,000 hours to become an expert.
Right.
He broke it into 4 stages, and he'd like, first you have to focus the problem at the level of the novice. You don't take a little 5-year-old who you're trying to teach tennis and stick them into Wimbledon and expect them to succeed. You have them bounce the ball on the floor, right? Or whatever they'd start out with. And then, the ball itself gives them the feedback, right? Whether they're, being able to catch it or not. You give a chess player, you have them practice moves and see what happens, right? You have a surgeon, first start off on maybe a model and have them do suture patterns, right? You don't start them off with, brain surgery, right?
Or a live human.
And I think in education, sometimes we kind of forget how long it took us to get expertise in a certain area and how lost people feel when they first come in. So that's why we started off with these simple cases. And then we would, as they would solve the simple cases, we would give them the feedback of my solution to the simple one. And then in class, we'd give them another case, which was kind of similar, but then they'd have to do like a TBL exercise around that. And And so it would just gradually ramp them up. So you start at the level of the learner, you ramp it up that it challenges them, that doesn't overwhelm them. You give them lots of feedback that's very timely. So you don't wait till the next day. You do it right when they're doing this as pre-work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you give them lots of practice and give them chances to correct their mistakes. So it fits in beautifully with TBL, because TBL kind of embodies deliberate practice if it's designed well. That
Mm-hmm.
whole 4-step process. And so, it just made so much sense to me that, this was really our theoretical framework. And years later, we actually invited Kay Anders Ericcson to be our keynote at the Veterinary Educational Collaborative at Iowa State. And he looked at it and he went, "That's it. That's exactly what." And so that was like really vindicating, right?
Absolutely.
So we also, at the time where TBL was this 250 member faculty learning community, we also had this diagnostic pathfinder. It evolved to a program we called ThinkSpace, because I'd have engineers come and look at what we were doing and they go, "Oh, I want my students to think like that too, because they've got to put pieces together." We had an English professor that, thought the same thing about writing. We had a journalism professor. We had a horticulture professor, a physics professor, and they'd go like, "Well, we like that, but we needed to do this one more thing." And so we had this wonderful programmer who ran our and educationalist that ran our learning management system, and he totally re-engineered the diagnostic pathfinder into this, we call it like the Swiss Army knife of educational tools that does all these things that all these people. And so that learning community went to well over 100 members, and we would get together and exchange ideas, and I would pick things from the journalism professor, and dietetics would pick things from my stuff, and we would, and it just spread all over like that. And now we use it extensively here in our program for pre-work in all of the different fields. But we had already, when we started doing that at Iowa State, it spread to every single college. I mean, we had everything from engineering to Greek mythology and everything in between,
Wow.
Yeah. And so, it's just been astonishing. And they all would say, it makes me a better, and we did research on, the instructors as well. And like, it makes me a better teacher. I understand my students better. They can see my way of thinking and I can see their way of thinking. And, it's like the students love to see how, they know the conclusion the professor makes, but not how they think through it. And this makes it very visible, and it follows deliberate practice. And so, I mean, we still give readings to our students, but the students love to have these, what we call an expert response. We give them maybe a short video. Students love it when their professors do this, right? Do a little maybe narrated PowerPoint, then maybe 10 minutes, and then you ask them a bunch of open-ended questions. They submit their answer, and then once they submit it, it pops up the professor's answer to that, and then they go to another video or a reading or something, and scaffolded deliberate practice, as we go through this. And so I think, rather than just giving them a lot of dense reading, it can be a much kinder and gentler way to learn, and so we've done a lot of both formative and summative evaluations on our courses, and repeatedly we hear from our students, what helped you learn most in this class? and it's the pre-work. It's the pre-work. It's the
Yeah.
the
Wow.
pre-work. They just, and when it's scaffolded nicely, we have this 4-part, what we call a plus delta. What helped me learn most in this class? What could this class do better to help me learn? What do I do that helps me learn, and what could I do better? And repeatedly, well scaffolded pre-work is by far the thing that helps them learn. And then if it's not scaffolded and it's too dense or too advanced or whatever, we just hear all the time, that's the thing that needs to be corrected to help me learn. And all those knowledge checks with the expert response, if they're not in there, they just say, I get lost, I get overwhelmed. And then your TBL sessions go so much better too. So, so when they're prepared, they're ready, they get engaged, your discussions can go so much better.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so impressive, not just that you've developed this, but that you've taken it, to every corner of the globe, is really nice. So when you do your plenary talk, you're going to have, I guess, an hour or something. What would you like the participants to take away from that talk?
So I'm just wanting people to consider a way that they might scaffold their work. I don't know how everybody prepares their students for. I know reading is a big thing, and I'm not against reading at all. It's just that when you think of a veterinary or a medical program, there's too much to learn, right? It's just absolutely too much to learn. And so we depend on our faculty to know, they're specialists in certain areas, and to know it's very, being day one ready is kind of what we're trying to do. We want them to be, after they graduate, they're ready to start practice. And so we're not trying to, in our program, we're not trying to educate specialists. We're trying to educate veterinarians that can be in a general practice and know what to do. And if they want to, go ahead and do a residency or a PhD, they'd be ready to do that too. But it's so often the case that specialists come in, and I'm a clinical pathologist, and I want all my students to know everything I do.
Right.
And, I went through, 14 years of higher ed to get there, and that's not going to happen in a 3 or 4 year program. So we have to define what that is and then make it accessible to them so they don't get lost along the way. And deliberate practice is one way of doing that. And another thing I want them to know is that in my faculty development, so now ThinkSpace, this is all open source stuff that I've been working on forever. And, and now I've been partnering with the fellow that, made the ThinkSpace, and he's now in a small group of developers, and we've now developed this program called Allele after 2 years of massive requirement gatherings from our people here, both instructional designers and faculty. And I use this now. It's just a lot easier to author in now, and there's a lot more tools and a lot more. It's all developed according to the requirements of educators, and I use it to teach faculty how to design TBL modules. And you probably know from your experience that it's hard to learn. It's like students that are learning how to interpret laboratory data. You look at, I've got to design a TBL course. It's not how I was taught. And so, Larry introduced me also to backward design. And so often when new faculty look at designing a TBL module, they get overwhelmed just like my students, and they try to forward design and race through it and get very lost along the way. And so this program, we've got it chopped up in little pieces, just like my ClinPath stuff. And I start with the end in mind and make them figure out what they want their students to do. And then we backward design that into, well, what would be the evidence that would, help them, show you that they can do those things. And then we create scenarios that would create that evidence. And then, you keep backward designing it. Well, what would they have to know in order for you to do that thing? And I have to gate it for the faculty, just like I did for the students, and break it up in little pieces. And so it just makes it so it's not such an overwhelming thing.
Yeah.
And we make sure that the 4 S's are in there, and that's part of it too. And we do the rats as part of that as well. But we start with the end in mind and do the backward design too. So yeah, so I'm hoping to just kind of start a conversation. I mean, I'm sure that some people are doing this sort of pre-work, but I just think that it really helps you to be able to make learning fun. I mean, like super fun and engaging. And I know that's the topic of this conference is engaging with TBL. That's the name of it, right? So,
that's right.
So I think it's really helped us to be able to make more engaging work for our students, the TBL modules. It's allowed us to prepare them better for class. And I would like to, start a conversation on how we can do that better and sort of share our practices, and maybe even, share some of our pre-work with each other too.
Excellent. Oh, well, that sounds like an absolutely fantastic plenary. I hope that the people who are watching this are as intrigued as I am and will plan to check out your talk at the TBL annual meeting. So, Dr. Holly Bender, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and your enthusiasm for this topic.